What's up, guys? Kurt Hughes here. We're talking about your setup today. Should you prepare for a low pitch and adjust to a high pitch, or should you prepare for a high pitch and adjust to a low pitch? Every hitter is different, okay? And both setups work. It just depends on what's going to work for you and how do you know when it's time to make a change. Enjoy this video. All right, so this is a pretty complex idea. We're talking about your setup in your swing and why it matters and what should your setup be. But before we even start there, I think we have to talk about hip hinge and why it plays a relevant role in our swing and understanding what it is. All right, so you're gonna have to hip hinge probably to some degree in almost every swing that you take, okay? Hip hinge is when my hips work backwards, my knees stay still, and my trunk leans forward, okay? And a good way to think of this is like when my trunk leans forward, wherever my trunk is leaning. So imagine if I put a line that like kind of points to where my chest is leaning, that's gonna set my angle of rotation. So when I swing, if my trunk is like this, I'm setting up for a pitch this height. So if I rotate, I'll rotate through that plane, right? If I'm more here with my spine, right, more straight up and down, I'm gonna rotate more through this plane, right? If I'm more here, you can see how that changes the plane that I create, okay? My spine angle changes that, and hip hinge is the thing that governs that, right? I can either hip hinge a lot, which will help me set up for a low pitch or attack a low pitch, or, okay, I can hip hinge a little, which will help me set up for a higher pitch, okay? So the mechanism by which we get to lower pitches, okay, with good direction, is we turn our hip hinge into side bend, okay? So here's hip hinge, okay, boom, like that, and here's the plane that I'm established, right? But if I just hip hinge and I turn, okay, that's not really setting me up to get through the baseball in any way. Generally speaking, when athletes rotate, their hip hinge, you don't want it to happen immediately. You don't want people to get into early extension and go like this in their swing. But when they rotate, hip hinge does go away. So when I say hip hinge goes away, I mean like it becomes straight through this area. Hip hinge is when there's a bend in this area, if that makes sense. So as hip hinge goes away, okay, that translates and turns into what we call side bend. Side bend is just when the shoulder gets closer to the hip, basically, right? Or the space between the rib cage and the pelvis gets less. It doesn't matter. Long story short, I'm getting more here, okay? And my hip hinge will turn into side bend, which will then allow me to get on path and in the correct direction without pulling across. If I do not side bend, as my hip hinge goes away, that turns into a swing that goes left. That's not what we want, okay? So it's important to understand that if you're gonna get to a low pitch effectively, you're going to have to turn your hip hinge into side bend. Okay, so now we're back to the setup idea. Okay, there's two ways that we can essentially hit pitches up in the zone and low in the zone, right? Because you don't necessarily want to be like a hitter who only can hit high pitches or only can hit low pitches. You can have a strength and a weakness, that's fine, but you don't want to be totally locked into the idea of like, if I know someone's going to attack me up, right? I don't want to get in a spot where like it's impossible for me to hit those pitches. So you want to at least have a strategy that you can use from a movement perspective that will work, okay? And the two strategies in my career that I've found do work, okay, is setting up for a low pitch or setting up for a high pitch, okay? So when I set up for a low pitch, okay, what I do is I basically create my hip hinge in my stride, so I can start however I want to, okay? So if I want to start straight, I want to start here, doesn't matter, okay? It matters to some people, but for the purposes of this this discussion, it doesn't matter, okay? So let's say I start here, okay? So I have my hip hinge already, okay? Kind of going a little bit this way, right? So I set up, my spine gets down during my stride, and if I see it down, then I just turn through it, boom, I'm already on that plane. I create my side bend, I get through that area, we're good to go, okay? And if I see it up, then I just stand up a little bit, boom, and I hit it, okay? There's a lot of really good hitters that have used that. The one that like really sticks out in my head that, I've seen a ton, David Ortiz, phenomenal at this. He kind of get here, boom, and then gets the high one, stands up on it and crushes it, okay? Really, really commonly used. You'll see it, all over the big leagues, all over MLB history. The one limitation with it is that sometimes when you teach it, that like top 2 inches of the zone, people struggle with. They'll have a tendency to swing under that pitch. So it's important to understand that, if that's the case, okay, then maybe it makes sense to go to this other route, okay? The one thing that I want to say first before we move to this other route, okay, is that setting up for the low pitch and adjusting to the high pitch is way, 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 way easier to do, okay? Way, way, way easier to teach. And you don't have to be an elite mover in order to do option 1, okay? Setting up for the low pitch, adjusting to the high pitch. You can be a pretty, I don't want to say average athlete, but like just a decent athlete and be able to do it at a pretty high level. The second one, you've really got to work on some other movement things in order to actually even functionally execute. So usually from a teaching perspective, we start with option 1, set up for the low pitch, adjust to the high pitch. And if we run into problems, then we'll teach option 2, because there's a large number of people who the high pitch thing is a non-issue. Sometimes you can just design your approach around what you're good at in hitting, okay? So I read this book a couple years ago. It's by Perry Husband. I think it's called Effective Velocity. That's the concept. Effective velocity basically is this idea that pitches that are up and in are functionally faster, and pitches that are low and away are functionally slower. It's something that we intuitively already know, but long story short, in this book, he talks about in one of Mike Trout's MVP years how in the top like inch of the zone, he hit 0 the whole year. And I was like flabbergasted by this idea, but in this next paragraph, he talks about how the reason that he hit 0 in the top inch or 2 of the zone is because he only swung at like 2 pitches the whole year there, okay? So it's a perfect example of, how to design your approach around what you're really good at. Mike Trout's really, really good at hitting pitches that are, that are lower, okay? So he just makes a collective decision to not swing at high pitches very often. And this is in, the world of Major League Baseball where people are trying to dominate the top of the zone. So it's important to understand that, like, if you wanted to just eliminate those top 2 pitches, and there's a really strong argument to top 2 inches of pitches, there's a really strong argument actually around that's maybe what you should do, because those pitches that are that high are so hard to hit and so hard to separate out as far as what's a pitch that you can hit and what's a pitch that you can't, that sometimes it makes more sense just to not swing at it at all. And I've spoken with college coaches that have designed their approach that way for their team. So this isn't like a thing that doesn't exist. However, if you wanted to set up your attack differently, where you want to attack the high pitches and then adjust to low pitches, there's also a strong argument for why you should do that instead. So I think I'd be remiss if I didn't at least have a discussion about that side of it and talk about how you would functionally do that. So let's dive into that for a second. Okay, so we just talked about how to adjust to high pitch, or how to set up for low and adjust to high, right? That's I'm going to hip hinge during my stride or prior to my stride, right? I'm going to create that angle, which allows me to attack the low pitches as my normal swing and then stand up to the high pitches. Papi, Albert Pujols, guys like that, guys like this, did this very, very well, and it's a thing that you can find on the internet a lot, okay? And a lot of people talk about it. One that's less talked about is the stand tall idea, okay? So when we talk about hip hinge, right, that's my spine going forward, right? When I talk about standing tall, that's my spine staying upright, as I talked about, right? the spine, wherever it rotates, wherever it's pointing, basically, right, is where I'm setting up to swing. Okay, so if we are setting up for a high pitch, that means that when I set my stride up, I want to prepare to hit that high pitch during my stride so I'm able to attack that functionally. However, when it's low, that's kind of where the problems run into, okay? So if I'm someone who's setting up high like this, boom, right, and I get a pitch that's low, if I'm not a functional athlete and I don't have really good swing mechanics, meaning like my ability to create stretch and shortening in my body, and I don't have good hinge mechanics, and that's the really most important one here, right? Hinge mechanics are like, you know, my ability to get into this position, right? But to get into that position like with force, okay? And that's really the problem here, right? Is that it's not that it's not that getting into the position is hard, right? Most athletes that are reasonable, teach them how to hinge. You can be like, okay, leave your knees still, get your butt back, get your spine forward, right? That part's not hard. But the problem is that there isn't a whole lot of exercises other than like a med ball slam or some like unique things that you can kind of invent that teach people how to get into a hinge in a forceful way. Everything is about getting out of a hinge in a forceful way, right? We're talking about like deadlifts, right? When I do a deadlift, I'm not getting into a hinge in a forceful way, although like in the eccentric phase, you're kind of doing that, but the weight is kind of putting you into a hinge versus you putting you into a hinge. You're focused more on getting out of the hinge in a forceful way. So a med ball slam, for example, right? If I did one of those, I'll go ahead and grab a med ball right now. Okay, so if I did a med ball slam, right? So here I am. I'm going to get into full extension with the rest of my body. And then when I go to do the slam, I'm going to try to hinge as aggressively as possible. So that way my body's learning how to get into a hinge position, okay? Problem is that a lot of people, when you do a basic med ball slam like this, they'll kind of, they'll race their hands ahead of the rest of their body. And that's the pattern that we see in their swing as well. So like, if I'm doing this right, I should feel like my hips are pulling my hands down. Can you see how as I do this, my hips running this way are what unfolds my hands into the slam? That's what needs to happen when we're getting to low pitches in our swing too. But what happens with most people is they'll get here and you'll be like, all right, slam it. And they'll be like that. In that scenario, right, my hands led the way, right? And then my hips followed. And when I translate that to the swing, okay, if I start tall right here, right, I get the low pitch, my hands are gonna lead the way, and then my hips are gonna follow, and I'm gonna end up with that butt out swing that's not powerful, that creates a lot of slice in the ball. And when athletes start in that upright position, what ends up happening is a lot of times when they get a pitch that's lower, they just throw their hands at it, either jam it into the ground or cut it so it spins and goes really high into the outfield, and it's not a functional hit. So what we need to do is we need to learn how to go from an extended position, okay, to a hinge position like mid-swing, okay? And it's a much more dynamic movement, and it's a lot harder to do than just standing up out of a hip hinge, because when you stand up out of a hip hinge, it's something that you do in the gym all the time, and it's really, really easy. So it's a much easier movement. So that said, with the way that Major League Baseball is going right now, it might make more sense to actually stand tall, okay, attack the top of the zone, and learn how to hinge dynamically, because most guys that are throwing the major leagues are attacking really vertically. So they're trying to move the ball up and down like this. So by setting up for the fastest pitch that you could see, which would be a fastball up and in the zone, and then adjusting to everything off of that, well, that probably gives us the best chance of success. Or as I said before, we can set up our approach to, you know, kind of give up a part of the zone. So either thing can work, right? And just because you are someone who hinges early and sets up for the low pitch, that doesn't mean you can't hit the high pitch. It does make it a little bit more difficult, and it becomes something that if you struggle, then there is a solution, and the solution probably is standing up taller. So this is a complex idea, but it's really important for you guys to understand that, like, you know, when we're taking someone through and we're setting someone up to, you know, develop as a hitter, there's method to the madness. It's like, well, we're starting this way because this is the easiest way to make really good progress, okay? Once we hit a roadblock, if we have some issues here with this pitch type, then we can try this. That said, if someone already is someone who hinges really well and stands up to the high pitches and struggles with attacking those, then maybe it makes sense to immediately put someone into a more upright profile. So I'm just going to summarize it because that was a really long video, and I'm just going to kind of like create almost like bullet points for it, okay? There's two ways that you can set up. You can either set up for the high pitch or the low pitch, okay? If you set up for the high pitch, you're going to do that by hinging during your load phase or your stride, okay? If you're going to set up for the high pitch, okay, you're going to do that by keeping your spine upright and following more of like a squat pattern during your stride phase, which will allow you to attack high pitches better, okay? The challenge is really wrapped up in the adjustment, okay? If I'm trying to stride for my high pitches, okay, hitting those low pitches in a functional way and actually staying on path of them will not be the easiest thing, okay? It's much easier to start low and adjust high than it is to start high and adjust low. However, it could be better to start high and adjust low for some hitters.